What if two nations, separated for almost 100 years by flags, governments, and passports, turned out to share the same blood? What if the line on the map meant almost nothing to the people standing right beside it? Before we go further, hit like, tap subscribe, and send this to one person who loves a good mystery, because this one gets stranger the deeper you go. Pakistan and Iran sit next to each other on the map, but in most people's minds, they belong to two completely different worlds. One speaks Persian and carries the memory of an ancient empire. The other speaks Urdu, follows cricket like a religion, and was born out of the breakup of British India less than 80 years ago. Two flags, two anthems, two founding stories. On paper, two separate peoples. The border between them runs for about 900 kilometers, cutting through some of the driest, harshest, and least studied land in all of Asia. Nobody talks about this border the way they talk about the Pakistan-India line, with its soldiers and its decades of tension. Nobody talks about it the way they talk about the Durand line with Afghanistan either. This frontier passes quietly through Balochistan, a region so remote that even people living inside Pakistan and Iran rarely stop to ask a simple question. Who actually lives on both sides of this line? Are they really different people, or did a colonial pen simply draw a border straight through a single family? For decades, almost nobody bothered to check. It felt obvious. Different flag, different language, different history, so of course, different people. That assumption sat quietly in the background, unquestioned, the way most assumptions about borders usually do. Nobody thought to actually open up the DNA and look. A team of scientists decided to stop guessing and start testing. They pulled genetic data from Pakistan's major ethnic groups and set it against Iran's own incredibly varied population. They studied mitochondrial DNA, passed down only through mothers. They studied the Y-chromosome, passed down only through fathers. And they studied genome-wide markers that reveal ancestry going back thousands of years. The question they wanted answered was simple to ask, but hard to answer. After nearly a century of separate governments, separate borders, and separate national stories, how different are the people of Pakistan and Iran, genetically speaking? The answer was not a clean yes or no. It was something far more interesting. Most of Pakistan sat clearly outside Iran's genetic circle, exactly as most people would expect. But one single ethnic group broke every expectation. Their genetic distance from people across the border came back so small that scientists struggled to describe it as a difference at all. It looked less like two nations and more like one family that happened to end up with two passports. This is the story of what happened when scientists finally compared the DNA of Pakistan and Iran, and why one result left researchers staring at their own data in disbelief. To understand why this discovery matters, you first need to drop an assumption most people carry without even realizing it. Iran is not one single genetic population. It never was. A major genome study looked at more than 1,000 people from 11 different Iranian ethnic groups. Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, Galakis, Mazandaranis, Arabs, and Baloch were all included. What the researchers found broke the simple picture of Iran as one uniform nation. The genetic variation inside several of these groups was actually larger than the variation found among Germans, a population often used as the standard example of diversity within a single European country. This alone should have made headlines on its own. A country most outsiders picture as one uniform Persian nation is, underneath the surface, a mosaic of populations that have kept their own distinct genetic fingerprints for thousands of years, even while living under the same flag, the same government, and the same official language. Diversity like that rarely gets discussed outside academic papers, buried under dry statistics that most people never read. Out of this data, researchers identified something they called the Central Iranian Cluster. This included Persians, Azeris, Kurds, Lurs, Galakis, Mazandaranis, and Iranian Arabs. These groups speak different languages, they follow different regional customs. Yet, underneath all of that, their genetic ancestry overlaps heavily. Scientists trace this shared foundation back at least 5,000 years, and some estimates push it closer to 10,000. Think about how strange that timeline actually is. Empires rose and fell across this land. Religions arrived and reshaped entire societies. Languages shifted so completely that modern Persian would sound almost foreign to someone speaking the tongue used on this plateau 3,000 years ago. And through all of it, the genetic thread running underneath barely frayed. This single fact changes the entire story. Most people assume that a country conquered again and again, first by Alexander the Great, then by Arab armies in the 7th century, and later by waves of Turkic-speaking groups from Central Asia, must have been genetically rewritten each time. Logic tells you that new rulers, new religions, and new languages should come with new blood. But the genetic record tells a different story. Culture changed, religion changed, rulers changed. The deep genetic core of the Iranian plateau mostly stayed the same. Layer after layer was added on top, but the foundation was never torn out and replaced. Not every group inside Iran's modern borders fits inside that central cluster, though. Some populations sit clearly outside it, carrying signs of more recent mixing from beyond the plateau. And it is exactly at this edge, where Iran's own internal diversity meets Pakistan's diversity, that the story gets genuinely shocking. This is where most casual observers get the whole picture backwards. People tend to imagine national borders as genetic borders too, as if crossing from one country into another should always mean crossing into a different gene pool. Iran alone proves that idea wrong before Pakistan even enters the conversation. A single nation can hold multiple distinct genetic stories inside it, some deeply connected to each other, some standing far apart, all wrapped inside one passport. Once you accept that Iran itself refuses to behave like a single genetic block, the door opens to a much stranger possibility. What if some of those internal Iranian threads reach beyond Iran's own borders entirely, stretching into a neighboring country that everyone assumes is a separate genetic story altogether? The Baloch people, living on both sides of the modern Iran-Pakistan border, turned out to be the single clearest example of genetic continuity found anywhere in this entire study. A detailed review of mitochondrial DNA across 19 different Iranian populations calculated something called genetic distance, a way of measuring how closely related two groups actually are. When researchers compared Baloch communities inside Iran with Baloch communities across the border, including those in Pakistan, the number came back close to 0. Think about what that actually means. A genetic distance near 0 is the kind of result scientists usually expect to see between two towns in the same province, not between two separate countries with their own governments, currencies, and militaries. Researchers who spend their careers comparing populations across the globe rarely see numbers this small between groups separated by an internationally recognized border, guarded checkpoints, and nearly a century of independent political history. This wasn't a case of shared ancient ancestry blurred by thousands of years of separation. This looked like one population, still connected, just carrying different documents. The same study found similar patterns among a few other cross-border groups, including Armenians, Turkmens, and Azeris living inside and outside Iran. But the Baloch case stood apart because it directly linked Iran to Pakistan, two countries with almost no other population showing anything close to this level of shared genetic identity across their shared frontier. This finding matches what earlier research on Pakistan's own population had already suggested. The Baloch community inside Pakistan carries a genetic signature scientists describe as fundamentally West Eurasian, closely tied to Iranian and Kurdish populations, across the wider Iranian plateau. Historical records point to a documented migration out of the Caspian region, beginning somewhere around the 10th or 11th century, as one likely source of this connection. But what this new cross-border comparison confirms, with striking statistical precision, is that this is not a faint echo of some distant shared ancestor from thousands of years ago. This is a living, measurable connection. The Baloch on both sides of the Iran-Pakistan border are, in a very real genetic sense, still close to being one people, simply split by a line drawn on a map. Before we go further, here is something worth sitting with for a second. If a border can run straight through a family and barely touch their DNA, how many other lines on our maps are doing the exact same thing without anyone noticing? Keep that question in mind. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, subscribe now, because we uncover stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Every other major ethnic group inside Pakistan tells a very different story when placed next to this same Iranian genetic framework, and the contrast is exactly what makes the Baloch case so remarkable. Punjabis, Pakistan's largest ethnic group, carry a genetic profile shaped heavily by Bronze Age steppe ancestry and deep roots in the ancient Indus Valley. Their connection to the central Iranian cluster is weak at best. Punjabis do carry some West Eurasian ancestry, but it arrived through a completely different route, through the Bronze Age migration corridor out of Central Asia, not through the Iranian plateau lineage that defines the Baloch. In simple terms, a Punjabi person from Lahore carries measurably less genetic connection to modern Iran than a Baloch person from Kalat does, even though both hold the same passport. This contrast matters because it shows the Baloch result isn't some quirk of the method or a fluke of sampling. If every Pakistani ethnic group showed a similarly tight connection to Iran, you might reasonably suspect the comparison itself was flawed somehow, or too broad to mean anything specific. Instead, the opposite happened. Punjabis stayed clearly separate. Sindhis stayed clearly separate. Only the Baloch collapsed the distance down to almost nothing. That kind of sharp, isolated result is exactly what makes scientists sit up and pay attention, because it points to something real and specific happening in one particular population's history, rather than some broad statistical noise touching everyone equally. It also means the story cannot be explained away as a quirk of geography alone. Plenty of other Pakistani communities live close to the western border too, yet none of them show anything close to what shows up in the Baloch data. Proximity on a map clearly is not enough to explain this. Something deeper, older, and far more specific had to be at work. Pakistan's small Parsi community adds another fascinating layer to this picture. Unlike the Baloch, whose Iranian roots stretch back thousands of years through continuous settlement, the Parsi connection to Iran comes from a much more recent and much more specific event. Zoroastrian refugees fled Persia after the Arab conquest in the 7th century and settled in South Asia roughly 1,200 years ago. They kept marrying almost exclusively within their own community ever since. Genetic studies of Parsi populations in both India and Pakistan show a clear tie to modern Iranian populations, in some ways closer to Iran than to their South Asian neighbors. But this is a different kind of story than the Baloch case. It is the genetic memory of one specific refugee migration, frozen in place by centuries of strict endogamy, not the deep, continuous overlap seen among the Baloch. Together, the Baloch and the Parsi prove something important. Pakistan's genetic links to Iran are not one single story. They are at least two entirely separate histories, unfolding on completely different timelines, one stretching back millennia and one much more recent. The Sistan and Balochistan border region deserves special attention here, because it is the exact place where this cross-border genetic continuity has been documented most clearly. This province is Iran's largest by land area and one of its most sparsely populated. It sits directly across from Pakistan's own Balochistan province, forming one continuous cultural and geographic zone that colonial mapmakers split between empires, and later, between two modern nations. Researchers studying genetic samples from this specific border area found that Sistani populations, related to but distinct from the broader Baloch group, share genetic patterns not only with Iran's core population, but with ancient genetic material recovered from archaeological sites across the border in Pakistan. This pushes the story of connection back even further than the medieval Baloch migration, deep into a much older chapter of shared history. It suggests that long before any king or migration wave that historians can name, people were already moving freely across this stretch of desert and mountain, treating it as one shared homeland rather than a frontier between two worlds. The border we draw on modern maps simply did not exist in any form their ancestors would have recognized. For comparison, Sindhi populations in Pakistan carry between 60 and 66% ancestry directly linked to the ancient Indus Valley civilization. Their roots sit firmly inside deep South Asian history with very little connection to Iran's genetic sphere. Pashtun populations sit somewhere in between, carrying real West Eurasian influence from Bronze Age Indo-Iranian migrations, along with a documented thread of ancient Greek ancestry from the era of Alexander's campaigns through the region. But even Pashtuns, despite this layered West Eurasian influence, do not come close to the near-total genetic continuity found specifically between Baloch communities on either side of the Iran-Pakistan frontier. This pattern connects to something Iranian geneticists have already established about their own country. Despite sitting at one of history's great crossroads, a corridor linking Africa, Europe, and Asia, and despite absorbing wave after wave of migration from Indo-European speakers, Arab conquerors, and Central Asian Turkic groups, Iran's core population has stayed genetically continuous for at least 5,000 years, and possibly closer to 10,000. Researchers call this pattern continuity despite geography. Iran's location shaped its culture, its language, and its religion dramatically, without reshaping its underlying genetic foundation nearly as much. This same deep continuity, the new research confirms, reaches directly across the modern border into Pakistan's Baloch population, suggesting that whatever process brought Baloch ancestors to their current homeland, whether through the documented medieval migration or older, deeper ties to the Iranian Plateau, it left behind a population still genetically continuous with Iran, rather than one that split off into something new. The story goes back even further than the medieval migration usually credited as the founding moment of the Baloch people. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, at its peak under rulers like Darius the Great in the 6th century before our era, directly governed territory, reaching into the edge of the Indus Valley itself. This region became one of the empire's easternmost provinces, creating centuries of sustained administrative, cultural, and genetic contact between the Iranian Plateau and the northwestern edge of South Asia, more than 1,000 years before the specific Baloch migration usually cited by historians. Centuries later, the same region passed through successive Persian-influenced empires, before the documented Baloch migration added yet another layer on top. The genetic continuity we see today likely is not the result of one single migration event. It is the product of layer upon layer of sustained contact stretching back well over 2,000 years, each wave reinforcing the connections built by the ones before it. Independent research on the Y-chromosome, the genetic marker passed only from father to son, backs up this entire picture using a completely different type of evidence. Studies of Pakistani Baloch communities consistently show close clustering with Iranian and broader Southwest Asian populations, and clear separation from Central Asian, East Asian, and South Asian reference groups. This is the same genetic neighborhood as modern Iran, not the Asig neighborhood shared by Pakistan's other major ethnic groups. Finding this exact pattern confirmed twice, once through maternal mitochondrial DNA and once through paternal Y-chromosome data, using different samples, different labs, and different research teams working on opposite sides of the border, gives scientists far more confidence than either piece of evidence could provide alone. There is one more detail buried in this research that deserves attention. A detailed study of Iranian mitochondrial. Diversity found that genetic differences did not consistently follow language boundaries at all. In other words, speaking a different language never fully blocked genetic exchange between neighboring groups in this region. This matters directly for the Baloch story because Balochi, the language spoken on both sides of the Iran-Pakistan border, belongs to the Iranian language family, closely related to Persian, but still its own distinct branch. The fact that Baloch communities show such deep genetic continuity with Iran's core population, despite speaking a language different from mainstream Persian, fits a pattern researchers keep finding across this entire region. Genetic ancestry and language, while connected, often go their own separate ways, in patterns no simple map could ever predict. Let's pause here for a moment before we go deeper into what this actually means for the people living it. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do me a quick favor. Drop a comment telling me which part surprised you the most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who would love it, and I read every single one. This discovery carries real weight beyond history books and lab reports. The Baloch people today live at a genuinely difficult political crossroads. Balochistan, as a cultural and geographic region, is currently split across 3 separate countries: the Pakistani province of Balochistan, Iran's Sistan and Baluchistan province, and smaller Baloch communities across the border in southern Afghanistan. This division was not drawn by nature or by the people who live there. It was drawn by colonial powers redrawing borders across the 19th and 20th centuries, mostly for reasons that had nothing to do with the communities actually living on that land. Trade routes, military strategy, and rival empires competing for influence mattered far more to the people holding the pens than the families who would spend the next 100 years explaining which side of a line they happened to be born on. Baloch nationalist movements on both the Iranian and Pakistani sides have pointed to this shared identity for decades, using it as part of arguments for greater autonomy, and in some more extreme cases, for an independent Baloch state uniting these divided lands. This genetic research does not settle that political question, and it was never designed to. Population genetics cannot decide questions of sovereignty. Those questions belong to political processes, not laboratory results. What the science does confirm, with unusual clarity, is that the basic idea behind these cross-border identity claims, that Baloch communities in Iran and Pakistan represent one continuous people divided by artificial modern borders, holds up remarkably well under serious scientific testing. It holds up better, in fact, than similar claims made by many other divided ethnic groups studied anywhere else in the world. This finding also fits into a much bigger pattern found across South Asia's borders. The same kind of story shows up again and again along the India-Pakistan border. Punjabi Jat Sikh communities remain genetically almost identical across that line, despite 80 years of separation. Sindhi, Hindu, and Muslim populations share 60 to 66% ancestry, even after partitions split their communities apart. Kashmiri populations show deep, consistent maternal continuity across the line of control that divides them today. Modern borders across South Asia and West Asia were drawn quickly, often during colonial withdrawal, partition, and political negotiation. They consistently fail to match the far older, far deeper genetic history of the people living on either side of them. The Baloch story, spanning not the India-Pakistan line, but the equally important and equally overlooked Iran-Pakistan frontier, adds one more clear, independently confirmed example to this same recurring pattern. There is a real practical side to this discovery, too, one that goes beyond history and politics entirely. Knowing that Baloch populations in Pakistan share such close genetic continuity with Baloch populations in Iran means that disease research, drug response studies, and genetic screening programs built for one population are likely to apply accurately to the other. This is genuinely useful for 2 national healthcare systems that otherwise have almost no formal channel for sharing medical research. Iran and Pakistan maintain limited scientific collaboration compared to what either country shares with other international partners, and genetic reference databases across this entire region remain far less developed than those in Europe or East Asia. confirming. This level of cross-border genetic continuity gives researchers on both sides a practical shortcut. Findings from Iranian Baloch health studies can reasonably guide medical research priorities for Pakistani Baloch communities, and the reverse holds true as well, even without any formal cooperation between Tehran and Islamabad. None of this takes anything away from the real, distinct national identities Pakistan and Iran have each built for themselves. Both nations have their own political systems, their own official languages, and their own modern histories, each shaped by leaders, wars, revolutions, and choices that belong entirely to the 20th and 21st centuries, not to ancient bloodlines. Since 1979, Iran has followed its own dramatic path after the Islamic Revolution, while Pakistan has followed its own separate journey as an independent nation carved out of British India in 1947. Shared genetic ancestry between specific communities does not erase or compete with these real, meaningful, and entirely legitimate modern identities. What the science actually shows is something narrower and far more specific. The map of genetic ancestry across this stretch of West and South Asia was never drawn using the same lines as the map of modern political power, and one particular population, the Baloch, happens to sit exactly on top of that mismatch, carrying a biological connection across the Iran-Pakistan border that very few other populations in the entire region can claim with this level of scientific certainty. Picture this for a moment. A Baloch grandfather living in Iran's Sistan and Balochistan province, and his cousin's family settled just across the frontier in Pakistan's own Balochistan. They hold citizenship in two different countries. They speak with slightly different regional accents, shaped by decades under two separate national education systems. They have lived under two completely different governments for the better part of a century. And yet, according to everything this research has uncovered, their DNA remains close enough that a lab technician, looking only at the genetic data, with no names and no birthplaces attached, would struggle to tell them apart. Closer, in the strict biological sense, than many people living in the very same Pakistani province but belonging to different ethnic communities. The passport in each man's pocket describes a division that, at the level of the genome, barely exists at all. Two governments, two currencies, two sets of laws they must follow every single day of their lives. And underneath all of it, one bloodline, still running quietly across a border neither of them chose. Sit with that for a moment. Every checkpoint, every visa stamp, every customs form between them represents a division that exists only on paper, only in the 20th century, only in the world of politics and power. It does not exist in their cells. It never did. That is what scientists actually found when they finally compared DNA across Pakistan and Iran. Not two cleanly separated national populations, and not one hidden population pretending to be two. Something far more precise and far more human than either of those simple stories. A shared genetic landscape where most of Pakistan sits clearly and measurably outside Iran's genetic core, while one specific community, spread across the mountains and deserts of Balochistan on both sides of a colonial-era border, remains close enough to be, genetically speaking, essentially one people, divided today by passports, by currencies, by governments and flags, but never truly divided at the one level that science can actually measure. The place where blood remembers what borders were built to make everyone forget. Maps get redrawn. Governments rise and collapse, flags change, color and design within a single generation. But the genetic story written into a population takes thousands of years to shift even slightly. Long after every current border on this planet has been redrawn, renamed, or erased entirely, something of this deeper story will likely still remain quietly written into the people who come after us. That is the real lesson hiding inside this research. Not just a fact about Pakistan and Iran, but a reminder about how young and how fragile our political lines really are, compared to the ancient, patient story still running underneath them. If this story changed how you think about maps, borders, and the people caught between them, that's exactly why we make these videos. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see it, and I'll see you in the next one.